Georgia versus Kentucky college football pick. This one is on Saturday. Georgia moves to 10-0 with their 45-19 road win at Mississippi State. Bulldogs produced 468 yards, 179 rushing on 33 carries. Defensively, Georgia held the Bulldogs to 3 yards per rush with 261 passing on 52 attempts. Stetson Bennett completed 68% of his passes, 7.8 yards per attempt. On the year, Bennett a 68% completion rate and also 8.8 yards per attempt. Kentucky, they're down to 6-4 here after a 24-21 home defeat to Vanderbilt. Wildcats posted 322 yards with 213 rushing on 31 carries. On defense, they gave up nearly 6 yards a carry to the Commodores with 184 passing on 23 attempts. Will Levis is a season-low 47.8% completions, 4.7 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Kentucky averaging only 260 yards, 3.7 yards per rush, 5.5 yards per pass attempt. In this period, the Bulldogs averaging 470 yards, 5 yards per rush, and 8.6 yards per attempt. The play here will be Georgia minus the 22.5. Indiana versus Michigan State college football pick Saturday. Indiana drops to 3-7 with their 56-14 road defeat at Ohio State. Hoosiers' offense produced only 269 yards with 150 rushing on 40 carries. Defensively, they allowed 8 yards per rush attempt with 322 passing yards on 30 attempts. Third string Dexter Williams saw the bulk of the action, completed 31% of his passes for 5.6 yards per attempt. On the season, Williams a 33% completion rate with 4.9 yards per attempt. Williams is in line for the start if Basilek doesn't play. Michigan State 5-5 with their 27-21 home win to Rutgers. Spartans posted 453 yards, 197 rushing on 35 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 5 yards per carry to the Scarlet Knights with 236 passing yards on 35 attempts. Peyton Thorne completed 54% of his passes in the win with 7.3 yards per attempt. He passed for 256 yards and 2 touchdowns. This season, Thorne a 63% completion rate with 7.1 yards per attempt. Hoosiers have lost 7 straight and failed to cover 3 straight. They have failed to cover all 4 on the road as their offense's average is 294 yards per game with 2.9 yards per attempt on the ground. On the road, Indiana is giving up 3.2 sacks a game. Best shot for Spartans to earn bowl eligibility is this game because they got Penn State on the road the following week. The play here will be Michigan State here at minus 11.5. Miami versus Clemson college football pick Saturday. Miami improved to 5-5 with their 35-14 road win at Georgia Tech. Hurricanes gained 353 yards with 217 rushing on 44 carries. Defensively, Miami allowed nearly 5 yards per rush with 234 passing on 43 attempts. Ja'Carri Brown completed 74% of his passes, 7.2 yards per attempt. He threw for 136 yards and 3 touchdowns. This season, Brown a 61% completion rate with 5.6 yards per attempt. Clemson improved to 9-1 with their 31-16 home win to Louisville. Tigers gained 439 yards in this one with 248 rushing on 45 carries. On defense, they allowed 5 yards per rush to the Cardinals with 250 passing on 37 attempts. DJ Uiagalelei completed 70% of his passes, 6.9 yards per attempt. On the year, Uiagalelei a 65% completion rate, 7.2 yards per attempt. Hurricanes have struggled against strong quarterbacks play we saw behind Florida State and Duke. Tigers have struggled in run defense the past 3 games, allowing 5.1 yards per attempt. Would expect Miami to keep this one on the ground. The play here will be Miami plus 19. Mississippi versus Arkansas college football pick Saturday. Ole Miss fell to 8-2 with their 30-24 home defeat to Alabama. Rebels produced 403 yards with 191 rushing on 49 carries. Defensively, they held their Crimson Tide to 3 yards per rush with 209 passing on 33 carries. Jackson Dart completed 58% of his passes, 6.8 yards per attempt. He passed for 212 yards and a touchdown. On the season, Dart a 61% completion rate with 8.6 yards per attempt. Arkansas sits at 5-5 with their 13-10 home defeat to LSU. Razorbacks posted 249 yards with 133 rushing on 45 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 4 yards per rush to the Tigers with 86 passing yards on 15 attempts. KJ Jefferson expected to return after missing the LSU game. Jefferson on the year a completion rate of 68%, 8.9 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Ole Miss allowing 432 yards, 4.4 yards per rush, and 7.6 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be on. Well, with Jefferson back, the play will be on Arkansas plus 2.5. Ohio State versus Maryland college football pick Saturday. Ohio State improved to 10-0 with their 56-14 home win to Indiana. Buckeyes gained 662 yards with 340 rushing with 43 carries. Defensively, they did allow over 3.5 yards per rush to the Hoosiers with 119 passing on 29 attempts. C.J. Stroud completed 61% in the win, 10.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 297 yards and 5 touchdowns. This year, Stroud a 67% completion rate, 9.9 yards per attempt. Maryland fell to 6-4 with their 30-0 road defeat at Penn State. Terrapins gained a season-low 134 yards, 60 rushing on 37 carries. On defense, the Terrapins allowed nearly 6 yards per rush with 164 passing on 30 attempts. Talia Tagliavoa completed 50% of his passes, 3.4 yards per attempt. This season, Tagliavoa a 68% completion rate with 7.7 yards per attempt. Maryland back home where the weather should be better. At home, the Terrapins are moving the football for 437 yards, 5.1 yards per rush, 261 passing with 7.9 yards per attempt. Buckeyes offense past 3 games averaging 465 yards, 6.2 yards per rush, 8.4 yards per attempt to play. Ohio State and Maryland over 62.5. Oklahoma State versus Oklahoma college football pick Saturday. Oklahoma State improved to 7-3 with their 20-14 home win to Iowa State. Cowboys posted 244 yards with 57 rushing on 35 carries. On defense, they held the Sooners to under 2 yards per rush with 274 passing yards on 43 carries. Both Rangel and Sanders expected to miss this game. So at quarterback, look for freshman Gunnar Gundy here. He completed 42% of his passes and lost to Cyclones with 8.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 103 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions on the season. At the third string, Gundy a 49% completion rate with 6.3 yards per attempt. Oklahoma, they're 5-5 after their 23-20 road defeat at West Virginia. Sooners gained 426 yards with 236 rushing on 40 carries. They allowed about 4 yards per rush to the Mountaineers with 203 passing yards on 34 attempts. Dalen Gabriel completed 61% of his throws, 6.8 yards per attempt. He threw for 190 yards. Season to date, Gabriel a 64% completion rate with 8.4 yards per attempt. At home, the Sooners are moving the football for 534 yards, 5.5 yards per rush, 304 passing for 9.1 yards per attempt. Cowboys defense on the road is giving up 504 yards, 5.7 yards per rush, 282 yards passing, 8.1 yards per attempt. Oklahoma State dealing with quarterback issues with the third string probable starter here on this road rivalry game. Play here, Oklahoma -7. TCU versus Baylor college football pick Saturday. TCU moved to 10-0 after their 17-10 road win at Texas. Horned Frogs put up a season-low 284 yards with 160 rushing on 43 carries. On defense, they held the Longhorns to just over 1 yard per carry with 171 passing on 39 attempts. Max Duggan completed 65% of his passes in the win, but a season-low 4.3 yards per attempt. On this season here, Duggan career highs here, 66% completion rate, 9.3 yards per attempt. Baylor fell to 6-4 with their 31-3 home defeat here to Kansas State. Bears gained 306 yards with 103 rushing on 23 carries. Defensively, the Bears allowed over 4 yards per carry to the Wildcats with 221 passing on 35 attempts. Blake Shapen completed 58% of his passes with 5.3 yards per attempt. He passed for 203 yards and 2 interceptions. This season, Shapen a 65% completion rate with 7.7 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Baylor allowing 404 yards and 4.6 yards per rush. The Bears have 2 losses at home. Play here will be TCU +2. Tennessee versus South Carolina college football pick. This one here on Saturday. Tennessee improved to 9-1 with their 66-24 home win to Missouri. Volunteers posted 724 yards in that game, 264 of it rushing on 37 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 5 yards per rush to the Tigers with 217 passing on 33 carries. Hendon Hooker completed 71% of his passes with 10.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 355 yards and 3 touchdowns. This season, Hooker a 71% completion rate with 10.1 yards per attempt. Hooker has thrown for 24 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. South Carolina, they're 6-4 after a 38-6 road win at Florida. Gamecocks posted 237 yards. That's a season low with 44 rushing on 23 carries. Defensively, they limited the Gators' passing game but allowed 374 rushing yards on 54 carries. Spencer Rattler completed 69% in the loss with 5.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 145 yards. On the year, Rattler a 65% completion rate, 8 touchdowns, 9 picks, 7.2 yards per attempt. Volunteers are in the discussion for a playoff spot. style points that matter the rest of the way for a one-loss Volunteers team that will not play in the SEC championship game. Gamecocks held at 10 points or fewer in 2 of their past 3 games. Exception was their game at Vanderbilt. Play here will be Tennessee minus 21.5. Texas versus Kansas college football pick here for Saturday. Texas fell to 6-4 with their 17-10 home defeat to TCU. Longhorns gained 199 yards, 28 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, Texas allowed over 3.5 yards per rush to the Horned Frogs with 124 passing on 29 attempts. Quinn Ewers in this one completed season lows here. 43% passing, 4.4 yards per attempt. On the year, Ewers' 55% completion rate, 7.1 yards per attempt. That's still very low for a Big 12 high-profile team to have that low percentage against Big 12 defenses. Kansas, they're 6-4 with their 43-28 road defeat here at Texas Tech. Jayhawks posted 525 yards, 242 rushing on 32 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 5 yards per rush with 246 passing yards on 34 attempts. Jalen Daniels expected to play. Daniels on the season completing 67% of his passes, 9.2 yards per attempt. He's passed for 11 touchdowns and an interception. Jayhawks have covered all 6 games under Daniels. On the road, the Longhorns have given up 494 yards, 351 passing for 7 yards per attempt. Jayhawks are moving the football for 467 yards at home. The play will be Kansas at +9. USC versus UCLA college football pick Saturday. USC improved to 9-1 with their 55-17 home win to Colorado. Trojans gained 531 yards, 185 rushing on 41 carries. Defensively, the Trojans allowed nearly 4 yards per rush to the Buffs with 124 passing on 21 attempts. Caleb Williams completed 54% of his passes, 10.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 268 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. On the year, Williams a 64% completion rate with 8.8 yards per attempt. UCLA fell to 8-2 after their 34-28 home defeat to Arizona. Bruins produced 465 yards, 220 rushing on 37 carries. Defensively, the Bruins allowed about 3.5 yards per rush to the Wildcats with 312 passing yards on 29 attempts. Dorian Thompson-Robinson completed 67% of his passes in the loss with a season low 6.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 245 yards and a touchdown. He ran for only 2.2 yards per carry with a touchdown and a fumble. This year, Dorian Robinson, a 71% completion rate, 8.2 yards per attempt. Dorian Thompson-Robinson running ability a key for the Bruins here. Past 3 games, their defense holding teams at 3.8 yards per rush attempt. In this period, Trojans allowing 303 passing yards and 8.1 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be on UCLA +2.5. Utah versus Oregon college football pick Saturday. Utah improved to 8-2 with their 42-7 home win to Stanford. Utes gained 514 yards, 279 rushing on 36 carries. On defense, the Utes held the Cardinals just over 1 yard per rush with 155 passing yards on 25 attempts. Cameron Reeson completed 60% of his passes with 6.6 yards per attempt. He passed for 219 yards in the win, 3 touchdowns and an interception. On the year, Reeson a 66% completion rate, 8.2 yards per attempt. Now, Oregon, they fell to 8-2 after a 37-34 home loss to Washington. Ducks posted 592 yards, 312 rushing on 51 carries. On defense, they surrendered 5 yards per rush with 408 passing yards on 35 attempts. Bo Nix completed 68% of his passes, 10 yards per attempt. He passed for 279 yards and 2 touchdowns. This year, Nix, career highs here. 73% completion rate, 9.2 yards per attempt. Bo Nix's health is a concern. He has practiced this week. Nix took a helmet to the thigh in the loss last week. Utes struggled against a mobile quarterback in their loss at UCLA, allowing 502 yards. At home, Oregon is moving the football for 539 yards. Utes on the road allowing 371 yards, 8.3 yards per pass attempt. The play will be Oregon at +2.5. Boston College versus Notre Dame college football pick Saturday. BC improved to 3-7 with their 21-20 road win at NC State. Eagles posted 329 yards in the win, with -1 rushing on 23 carries. On defense, the Eagles limited the Wolfpack passing game and surrendered 200 rushing yards on 44 carries. Emmett Moorhead completed 60% of his passes with 6.9 yards per attempt. He passed for 330 yards with 3 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. This year, Moorhead a 58% completion rate with 6.7 yards per attempt. Notre Dame moves to 7-3 with their 35-32 road win at Navy. Fighting Irish gained 335 yards with 66 rushing on 34 attempts. Defensively, the Fighting Irish allowed over 5 yards per rush with 108 passing on 13 attempts. Drew Pine completed 81% of his passes with 12.8 yards per attempt. He threw for 269 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. On the year, Pine a 63% completion rate with 7.6 yards per attempt. Eagles' offense has shown improvement the past 2 games with their young quarterback Moorhead. Notre Dame has struggled to cover against the losing teams on their schedule. The play here will be Boston College at plus the 21. Cincinnati versus Temple, college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Cincinnati 8-2 with their 27-25 home win to East Carolina. Bearcats gained 310 yards with 66 rushing on 26 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 5.5 yards per rush to ECU with 280 passing on 46 attempts. Ben Bryant completed a season-low 47% completions, 8.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 244 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. On the year, Bryant a 62% completion rate with 8 yards per attempt. Temple 3-7 after their 43-36 road defeat at Houston. Owls posted 533 yards with 47 rushing on 26 carries. Defensively, they surrendered nearly 8 yards per rush to the Cougars with 289 passing on 40 attempts. E.J. Warner completed 71% of his passes, 8.2 yards per attempt. He passed for 486 yards and 3 touchdowns. On the year, Warner a 59% completion rate, 6.8 yards per attempt. Bearcats defense not as good as in seasons past. On the road, they allow 374 yards, 6.6 yards per attempt. Freshman quarterback for the Owls has shown improvement. The play here will be Temple at plus the 17. Duke versus Pittsburgh, college football pick for Saturday. Duke moved to 7-3 with their 24-7 home victory at Virginia Tech. Blue Devils posted 427 yards with 165 rushing on 41 carries. On defense, Duke held the Hokies to 4 yards per carry with 177 passing yards on 28 attempts. Riley Leonard completed 61% of his passes for 8.5 yards per attempt. On the year, a 64% completion rate with 7.6 yards per attempt. Pittsburgh moved to 6-4 after their 37-7 road victory to Virginia. Panthers gained 397 yards, 189 rushing on 48 carries. They returned 2 interceptions for touchdowns in the first quarter. On defense, they limited the Cavaliers to -8 yards rushing on 24 carries and limited the passing game. Keaton Slovis completed 58% of his passes with 8.7 yards per attempt. Slovis threw for 208 yards and a touchdown. On the year, Slovis a 59% completion rate with 7.6 yards per attempt. Duke has won 3 of 5 on the road with their losses by 7 or fewer points. Slovis' numbers have not been very impressive. The play here will be Duke at +8. Florida versus Vanderbilt, college football pick for Saturday. Florida improved to 6-4 with their 38-6 home victory to South Carolina. Gators gained 515 yards with 374 yards rushing on 54 carries. Defensively, they limited the Gamecocks to less than 2 yards per rush with 193 passing yards on 27 attempts. Anthony Richardson completed 48% of his passes for 4.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 112 yards and 2 touchdowns. On the season, Richardson completes 55% of his passes with 7.6 yards per attempt. Vanderbilt sits at 4-6 after their 24-21 road victory at Kentucky. Commodores posted 448 yards with 264 rushing on 44 carries. Defensively, they surrendered 7 yards a carry to the Wildcats with 109 passing yards on 23 attempts. Mike Wright hit on 52% of his passes with 8 yards per attempt. He passed for 184 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. On the season, White has a 57% completion rate with 7 yards per attempt. Gators have got their offense clicking, averaging over 500 yards the past 2 games after facing Texas A&M on the road and South Carolina at home. Winning margins have been by double digits in those games. Past 3 games, Vanderbilt allowing nearly 5 yards per rush. The play here will be on Florida -14.5. Georgia Tech versus North Carolina, college football pick. This one here on Saturday. Georgia Tech sits at 4-6 after their 35-14 home win to Miami. Yellow Jackets posted 363 yards with 129 rushing on 27 carries. Their defense surrendered 5 yards per rush to the Hurricanes with 136 passing on 19 attempts. Zach Gibson, 57% completion rate, 5.7 yards per attempt. He had 120 passing yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Season-wide, Gibson career lows here, 49% completion rate, 4.4 yards per pass attempt, and that is for the Akron transfer. North Carolina improved to 9-1 after their 36-34 road win at Wake Forest. Tar Heels posted 584 yards, 136 rushing on 38 carries. Defensively, they gave up over 4 yards per rush to the Demon Deacons with 320 passing on 31 attempts. Drake May completed 63% of his passes, 9.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 448 yards and 3 touchdowns. This season, May a 70% completion rate, 9.5 yards per attempt. May has thrown for 34 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Tar Heels a long shot to make the playoffs, but style points will still be in play here. Gibson's season numbers a major concern here against May. Past 3 games, Yellow Jackets pass defense allowing 8.2 yards per attempt. The play here will be on North Carolina minus 21. Illinois versus Michigan college football pick Saturday. Illinois fell to 7-3 with their 31-24 home defeat to Purdue. Fine Illini gained 303 yards with 102 rushing on 33 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 4 yards per carry to the Boilermakers with 237 passing yards on 40 attempts. Tommy DeVito hit on 56% of his passes with 6.3 yards per attempt. On the year, DeVito a 70% completion rate with 7.3 yards per attempt. Michigan improved to 10-0 with their 34-3 home victory. To Nebraska, Wolverines gained 412 yards with 264 rushing on 49 carries. Offensively, they held the Cornhuskers to under 3 yards per carry with 71 passing yards on 20 attempts. J.J. McCarthy, a season-low 47% completion rate with 7.6 yards per attempt. This year, McCarthy, a season-low 47% completions with 7.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 129 yards and 2 touchdowns. On the year, McCarthy, a 69% completion rate with 8.2 yards per attempt. Final Illini has covered 6 of 7 on the road. Past 3 games, their defense holding teams to 307 yards with 3.7 yards per attempt on the ground. Final Illini has not been blown out in games this year as their defense has been strong. Play here will be Illinois plus the 17.5. Iowa versus Minnesota college football pick Saturday. Iowa improved to 6-4 with their 24-10 home win to Wisconsin. Hawkeyes gained just 146 yards in this one with 52 rushing on 45 carries. Defensively, they limited the Badgers to less than 2 yards per rush, 176 passing on 35 attempts. Spencer Petras completed 61% of his passes, 4.1 yards per attempt. This season, Petras a 56% completion rate, 6 yards per attempt. Minnesota improved to 7-3 with their 31-3 home win at Northwestern. Golden Gophers posted 366 yards, 302 rushing on 58 carries. Defensively, they held the Wildcats to under 4 yards per rush with 206 passing on 32 attempts. Tanner Morgan, doubtful. Ethan Kalakmanis completed 54% of his passes with 4.9 yards per attempt. On the season, Kalakmanis, a 46% completion rate with 7.9 yards per attempt. Now, both defenses in great form, but Iowa better against the run the past 3 games. But a backup quarterback for Minnesota facing this good Hawkeyes defense concern. The play here will be Iowa plus the 2.5. Kansas State versus West Virginia college football pick for Saturday. Kansas State improved to 7-3 with their 31-3 road win at Baylor. Wildcats posted 405 yards with 184 rushing on 44 carries. Defensively, they did allow 4 yards per carry to the Bears with 203 passing on 38 attempts. Will Howard completed 70% of his passes in the win with 7.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 196 yards and 3 touchdowns. On the year, Howard, a 63% completion rate with 8.5 yards per attempt. West Virginia improved to 4-6. With their 23-20 home win to Oklahoma, the Mountaineers posted 406 yards with 203 rushing on 53 carries. Defensively, the Mountaineers allowed nearly 6 yards per rush with 190 passing yards on 28 attempts. J.T. Daniels completed 58% of his passes, 5.4 yards per attempt, and an interception. Daniels was benched. Garrett Green relieved, completed 54% of his throws, 6.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 138 yards and a touchdown. Now, Mountaineers must win out to become bowl eligibility. At home, the Mountaineers are averaging 492 yards, 4.9 yards per rush, and 7.5 yards per pass attempt. Wildcats on the road allowing 252 passing yards with 7.2 yards per attempt. The play here will be West Virginia plus 7.5. All right, we get started here with Navy and UCF college football pick here for Saturday. Navy fell 3-7 with their 35-32 home defeat to Notre Dame. Midshipmen did gain 360 yards in this one with 255 rushing on 46 attempts. Defensively, they held the Fighting Irish to less than 2 yards per rush, 269 yards passing on 21 attempts. Xavier Arline, 2 of 4 passing for 57 yards and a touchdown. He rushed 12 times for 59 yards and a touchdown. On the year, our line a 33% completion rate, 6.7 yards per attempt. He is rushing this year for 5 yards a carry. He was injured last week, so Messiah Minor relieved, went 4 of 7 for 51 yards and a touchdown. He's more of the passer of the three quarterbacks on the Navy roster. UCF improved to 8-2 after their 38-31 road win at Tulane. Knights gained 475 yards with 343 rushing on 53 carries. On defense, UCF allowed nearly 6 yards per rush to the Green Wave with 236 passing on 39 attempts. John Plumlee completed 57% of his passes in the win, but only 4.4 yards per rush. He threw for 132 yards and a touchdown. This season, Plumlee has 63% completion rate, 8.2 yards per attempt. Midshipman defending the run well this season. Maynard gives Navy a solid passing threat. The play here will be on Navy at plus the 17.5. NC State versus Louisville college football pick. This one here on Saturday. NC State improved to 7-3 with their 21-20 home defeat to Boston College. Wolfpack gained 335 yards with 200 rushing on 44 carries. Third string here, MJ Morris completed 50% of his passes, 5.6 yards per attempt. On the year, Morris a 60% completion rate, 7.7 yards per attempt. He has 7 touchdowns, 1 interception. Louisville fell to 6-4 after a 31-16 road defeat at Clemson. Cardinals gained 400 yards, 150 rushing on 30 carries. Defensively, they surrendered over 5 yards a carry to the Tigers with 191 passing on 28 attempts. Malik Cunningham, day-to-day, got that shoulder injury, so he's a question mark. On the season, Cunningham, a 63% completion rate, 7.3 yards per attempt. Brock Dolman on the year, 52% completion rate, 7.6 yards per attempt. Morrison upgrade here, quarterback for the Wolfpack. Quarterback situation, a major concern for the Cardinals. NC State defense past 3 games, allowing less than a yard per carry on the ground. The play will be NC State +4. Northwestern versus Purdue college football pick Saturday. Northwestern fell to 1-9 with their 31-3 road defeat at Minnesota. Wildcats gained 278 yards in this one with 72 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, they contained the Golden Gophers' pass attack and allowed 302 yards rushing on 58 attempts. Brendan Sullivan left the game in the second half due to injury. On the year, Sullivan a 74% completion rate with 6.1 yards per attempt. Ryan Olinsky in relief last week completed 3 of 11 for 68 yards and a pick. He has thrown this season for 56% completion rate and 6.4 yards per attempt. Purdue, they're now 6-4 with their 31-24 road win at Illinois. Boilermakers posted 380 yards with 143 rushing on 32 carries. Defensively, they held the final line to just 3 yards per carry and 201 yards passing on 32 attempts. Aiden O'Connell completed 62% of his passes with 5.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 237 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. Past 3 games, Wildcats offense producing only 246 yards, 2.5 yards per rush. Boilermakers in this period running for 3.6 yards a carry. Now Northwestern has the defense to keep the scoring down. The play here will be on Purdue and Northwestern under 49.5. Oregon State versus Arizona State college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Oregon State improves to 7-3 with their 38-10 home win to Cal. Beavers gained 362 yards with 166 rushing on 45 carries. Defensively, Oregon State held Cal to 9 yards, rushing with 147 passing on 34 attempts. Ben Gulbranson completed 65% of his passes with 6 yards per attempt. He passed for 137 yards and 2 touchdowns. This season, Gulbranson a 62% completion rate with 7.54 yards per attempt. Arizona State fell to 3-7 with their 28-18 road defeat at Washington State. Sun Devils gained 333 yards with 121 rushing on 34 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per rush to the Cougars with 219 passing on 37 attempts. ASU has shown improvement offensively since the coaching change. The improvement has shown more so on their home games. Beavers on the road giving up 402 yards with 281 passing for 7.2 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be Arizona State at +8. Penn State versus Rutgers college football pick Saturday. Penn State improved to 8-2 with their 30-0 home win to Maryland. The Lions gained 413 yards with 249 rushing on 43 carries. Defensively, they limited the Terrapins to under 2 yards a carry with 74 passing on 23 attempts. Sean Clifford, a season-low 52% completion rate, 6 yards per attempt. He threw for 139 yards and a touchdown. On the year, Clifford a 62% completion rate, 7.8 yards per attempt. Rutgers fell to 4-6 with their 27-21 road defeat at Michigan State. Scarlet Knights gained 460 yards with 224 rushing on 44 carries. Defensively, they allowed 5.5 yards per rush with 256 passing on 35 attempts. Gavin Wimsatt completed season highs 59% with 6.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 236 yards and 2 touchdowns on the year. Wimsatt a 48% completion rate with 5.7 yards per attempt. Penn State playing for a New Year's Day Bowl. Past 3 games, Rutgers defense giving up 420 yards, 5.2 yards per rush, 6.4 yards per pass attempt. The Lions in this period, the defense is holding teams at 261 yards, and the offense putting up 460 yards. Player will be Penn State minus 19. Stanford versus California college football pick Saturday. Stanford fell to 3-7 after their 42-7 road defeat at Utah. Cardinal gained 177 yards with 22 rushing on 26 attempts. Defensively, they surrendered over 7 yards per carry to Utah with 235 passing on 34 attempts. Tanner McKee completed 48% of his passes, 6.7 yards per attempt. This season, McKee a 60% completion rate, 6.9 yards per attempt. California dropped to 3-7 after their 38-10 road defeat at Oregon State. Golden Bears gained a season low 156 yards with 9 rushing on 16 carries. On defense, they surrendered just under 4 yards a carry with 196 passing on 27 attempts. Jack Plummer completed 65% of his throws, 4.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 147 yards and an interception. On the year, Plummer a 63% completion rate with 6.7 yards per attempt, and that is for the Purdue transfer. Past 3 games, Cal defense allowing 488 yards and Stanford 517. Play here will be Stanford, California over 46. Syracuse versus Wake Forest college football pick Saturday. Syracuse 6-4 with their 38-3 home defeat at Florida State. The Orange gained 160 yards, 95 rushing on 31 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 5.5 yards per rush to the Seminoles with 190 passing on 31 attempts. Carlos Del Rio Wilson may get the start with that injury to Garrett Schrader. On the season, he has completed 43% of his passes, 6.7 yards per attempt. Wake Forest fell to 6-4 with their 36-34 home defeat to North Carolina. Demon Deacons gained 490 yards, 170 rushing on 41 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per rush with 448 passing yards on 49 carries. Sam Hartman completed 58% of his passes with 10.3 yards per attempt. He passed for 320 yards and 4 touchdowns and an interception. Second game back for the Orange starting quarterback here. Schrader looks like he could be giving it a go here. He is completing 65% of his passes for 8.2 yards per pass attempt this season. Play here will be Syracuse at plus 10. Texas Tech versus Iowa State college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Texas Tech 5-5 with their 43-28 home win to Kansas. The Red Raiders gained 510 yards with 264 rushing on 48 carries. Eventually, they allowed 8 yards per rush to the Jayhawks with 283 passing on 33 attempts. Tyler Schau completed 60% of his passes with 7.5 yards per attempt. He threw for 246 yards and a touchdown. This season, Schau a 54% completion rate with 7.3 yards per attempt. Iowa State fell to 4-6 with their 20-14 road defeat at Oklahoma State. Cyclones put up 333 yards with 59 rushing on 36 carries. They limited the Cowboys' ground attack to just 1.5 yards a carry with 187 passing on 25 attempts. Hunter Dekkers completed 67% of his passes with 6.5 yards per attempt in the loss. He threw for 274 yards, a touchdown, and 3 interceptions. On the year, Dekkers completing 67%, 6.6 yards per attempt. The Cyclones have defended well at home, holding teams at 3.3 yards per rush and 6.7 yards per pass attempt. Red Raiders on the road allowing 398 yards, 4.9 yards per rush to opponents. Red Raiders on the road have lost all 4 games by 9 points or greater. Play here will be Iowa State at minus the 3.5. UAB versus LSU college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. UAB improved to 5-5 with their 41-21 home win to North Texas. Blazers posted 505 yards, 271 rushing on 51 carries. Defensively, UAB held the Mean Green to just over 3 yards per rush with 159 passing on 32 attempts. Dylan Hopkins completed 65% of his passes in the win, 10.2 yards per attempt. On the year, Hopkins a 67% completion rate, about 10 yards per attempt. The LSU Enders played 8-2 after their 13-10 road win at Arkansas. Tigers gained 284 yards, 198 rushing on 51 carries. Defensively, LSU held the Razorbacks to under 3 yards per rush with 116 passing on 22 attempts. Jane Daniels completed 53% of his passes, 5.7 yards per attempt. He threw for just 86 yards and an interception. Season to date, Daniels a 69% completion rate, 7.3 yards per attempt. Tigers, a two-loss team, will still have to earn those style points. Play here will be LSU minus 15. Virginia Tech versus Liberty, college football pick for Saturday. Virginia Tech fell to 2-8 with their 24-7 road defeat at Duke. Hokies gained 281 yards with 104 rushing on 26 carries. Defensively, they surrendered 4 yards per rush to the Blue Devils with 262 passing yards on 31 attempts. Grant Wells hit on 57% of his passes, 6.3 yards per attempt on the year, a 58% completion rate with 6.5 yards per attempt. Liberty fell to 8-2 with their 36-33 road defeat to Connecticut. Flames posted 474 yards of offense with 267 rushing on 41 attempts. Defensively, they limited the Huskies' passing game, but allowed 208 yards rushing on 38 carries. Jonathan Bennett completed 61% of his passes in defeat, 5.6 yards per attempt. On the year, Bennett a 58% completion rate and 7 yards per attempt. Liberty defense at home holding teams at 315 yards and 3.7 yards per rush with 5.6 yards per pass attempt. On the road, Hokies struggled to convert third downs, and they put up just less than 17 points a game. Play here will be Liberty at -9. Washington State versus Arizona, college football pick Saturday. Washington State improves to 6-4 with their 28-18 home win to Arizona State. Cougars produced 356 yards with 137 rushing on 35 carries. Defensively, they allowed 3.5 yards per rush to the Sun Devils with 212 passing yards on 33 carries. Cameron Ward completed 59% of his passes with 5.9 yards per attempt. This season, Ward a 64% completion rate with 6.8 yards per attempt. Arizona improved to 4-6 with their 34-28 road win at UCLA. Wildcats gained 436 yards with 124 rushing on 36 carries. Defensively, they allowed 5.5 yards per rush to the Bruins with 245 passing yards on 39 attempts. Jane DeLaura completed 78% of his passes with 11.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 315 yards and 2 touchdowns on the year. DeLaura a 63% completion rate with 8.5 yards per attempt. The signal caller has thrown for 24 touchdowns with 8 interceptions. Bowl eligibility is in play for Arizona with the win here and the following week against a down Arizona State team. Past 3 games, Wildcats averaging 455 yards, 5.1 yards per rush, 9 yards per pass attempt. Washington State has the rivalry game the following week against Washington. The play here will be Arizona +4. Wisconsin versus Nebraska, college football pick Saturday. Wisconsin fell to 5-5 with their 24-10 road defeat to Iowa. Badgers gained 227 yards with 51 rushing on 31 carries. On defense, they limited the Hawkeyes to just over 1 yard per rush with 94 passing yards on 23 attempts. Graham Mertz completed 46% of his passes with 5 yards per attempt. He passed for 176 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. This season, Mertz a 58% completion rate with 7.8 yards per attempt. Nebraska dropped to 3-7 after their 34-3 road defeat at Michigan. Cornhuskers a season low 146 yards with 75 rushing on 25 carries. Defensively, Nebraska allowed over 5 yards per rush to the Wolverines with 148 passing on 20 attempts. Chubba Purdy exited the game with an injury. Casey Thompson has a bad elbow. Third string Logan Smothers went 4 of 8 for 15 yards. On the season, Smothers a 52% completion rate with 5.1 yards per attempt. Cornhuskers have lost 4 straight. Past 3 games, Badgers holding opponents to 255 yards and 2.3 yards per attempt. Nebraska quarterback situation pretty messy. The play here will be on Wisconsin, Nebraska under 41. Western Kentucky versus Auburn, college football pick Saturday. Western Kentucky sits at 7-4 with that 45-10 home win to Rice. Hilltoppers put up 495 yards with 118 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per rush to the Owls with 161 passing on 29 attempts. Austin Reed completed about 70% of his passes, 11.4 yards per attempt. He threw for 377 yards with 3 touchdowns and an interception. Season to date, Reed a 68% completion rate, 8.1 yards per attempt. Auburn 4-6 with their 13-10 home win to Texas A&M. Tigers gained 330 yards, 270 rushing on 55 carries. Offensively, they limited the Aggies to nearly 4 yards per rush with 121 passing on 36 attempts. Robbie Ashford completed 46% of his passes, 4.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 60 yards, a touchdown, and interception on the year. Ashford a 50% completion rate, 6.9 yards per attempt. Tigers offense has struggled this season. Even in the non-conference, they beat San Jose State, but not really by much here, just 24-16. I would rate Western Kentucky's offense better. On the road, Western Kentucky's offense is averaging 494 yards, and their defense holding teams to 3.5 yards per rush. The play here will be Western Kentucky +6. Arkansas State versus Texas State, college football pick for Saturday. Arkansas State improved to 3-7 with their 35-33 home win to Massachusetts. Red Wolves gained 275 yards, 133 rushing on 24 carries. On defense, Arkansas State allowed over 3 yards per rush with 307 passing yards on 43 attempts. James Blackman completed 55%, 7.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 142 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. On the year, Blackman a 66% completion rate with 7.4 yards per attempt. Texas State drops to 3-7 after their 38-21 road defeat at South Alabama. Bobcats produced 230 yards, 87 of it rushing on 25 carries. Defensively, they allowed under 3 yards per rush to the Jaguars with 274 passing yards on 34 attempts. Lane Hatcher completed 57% of his passes with a season-low 3.4 yards per attempt. He finished with 143 passing yards, a touchdown, and an interception. On the year, Hatcher a 63% completion rate with 6.1 yards per attempt. Prefer Blackman of these two quarterbacks, and his form is better. Past 3 games, Bobcats gained only 280 yards, 2.7 yards per rush. The play here will be on Arkansas State at +6. Boise State versus Wyoming, college football pick Saturday. Boise State improved to 7-3 with their 41-3 road win at Nevada. Broncos piled up 528 yards with 267 rushing on 47 carries. Defensively, they limited the Wolfpack to under 4 yards per rush with 123 passing on 31 attempts. Taylon Green completed 50% of his passes, 9.9 yards per attempt. He passed for 218 yards and a touchdown. On the season, Green a 66% completion rate, 8.4 yards per attempt. Wyoming improved to 7-3 after that 14-13 road win at Colorado State. Cowboys gained 236 yards with 142 rushing on 37 carries. They held the Rams to less than 4 yards to carry with 251 passing on 26 attempts. Jaden Clemens completed 63% of his passes with 8.2 yards per attempt. He came in for an injured Andrew Peasley. On the season, Clemens a 69% completion rate, 8.8 yards per attempt. He's thrown only 13 passes. Quarterback situation, the major concern for Wyoming. Past 3 games, Broncos holding teams to 317 yards and 3.2 yards per rush. In that period, their offense moving the football for 455 yards and 9.6 yards per pass attempt. Broncos have shown huge improvement with the quarterback change. Play here will be Boise State at -14. Colorado State and Air Force, college football pick Saturday. Colorado State fell to 2-8 with their 14-13 home defeat to Wyoming. Rams put up 372 yards, 121 rushing on 33 carries. Defensively, they allowed 3.5 yards per rush with 94 passing on 15 attempts. Clay Millen completed 69% of his passes with 9.7 yards per attempt. He threw for 251 yards and an interception. On the season, Millen a 70% completion rate with 8.2 yards per attempt. Air Force 7-3 following their 35-3 home win to New Mexico. Falcons posted 470 yards, 428 rushing on 70 carries. Defensively, they limited the Lobos with less than 2 yards per rush and 128 passing yards on 21 attempts. Zeke Daniels, 2 of 2 for 42 yards and a touchdown. He rushed for 113 yards and 2 touchdowns with his 9 carries. He's averaging 5.4 yards per carry on the ground this season, and he's passing for 7.2 yards. He's passing 7.2 times per game or 10 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Rams allowing 368 yards, 4.1 yards per rush. So Millen has been accurate as well. The play will be Colorado State +22. Colorado versus Washington, college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Colorado fell to 1-9 with their 55-17 road defeat to USC. Buffaloes gained 259 yards with 135 rushing on 35 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4.5 yards per rush to the Trojans with 346 passing yards on 33 attempts. JT Shrout completed 52% of his passes, 5.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 124 yards and an interception. This season, Shrout a 45% completion rate, 5.9 yards per attempt. Washington sits at 8-2 after a 37-34 road win at Oregon. Huskies posted 522 yards, 114 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, the Huskies allowed over 6 yards per attempt on the ground with 280 passing on 28 attempts. Michael Penix completed a season-high 74%, 11.7 yards per pass. He threw for a season-high 408 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. This season, Penix a 67% completion rate, 8.5 yards per attempt. Back-to-back road games for the Buffs. On the road, they are allowing 532 yards, and at home, the Huskies averaging 519 yards. Play here will be Washington minus 30.5. UConn versus Army college football pick. This one is on Saturday. UConn improved to 6-5 with their 36-33 home win to Liberty. Huskies posted 318 yards with 208 rushing on 38 attempts. Defensively, UConn surrendered 6.5 yards per rush to the Flames with 207 passing yards on 39 attempts. Zion Turner completed 71% of his passes in the win with 4.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 303 yards with a touchdown and interception. On the year, the freshman a 61% completion rate with 5.4 yards per attempt. Army sits at 3-6 after their 10-9 road defeat at Troy. Midshipmen gained 357 yards, 275 rushing on 62 attempts. Defensively, the Black Knights allowed over 3 yards per carry to the Trojans with 192 passing yards on 31 attempts. Taylor went 2 of 5 for 40 yards. 2 of 5 for 52 yards. He rushed 27 times for 100 yards and a touchdown. On the year, he averaged 4.8 yards per carry and a 43% completion rate and 15.6 yards per attempt. UConn, they've covered 7 straight. They are bowl eligible. 6-win teams have really no guarantee of a bowl berth, so 7 wins will lock in a berth. Past 3 games, Huskies rushing for 4.8 yards per rush, and Army in this period allowing 4.6 yards per run attempt. Play will be on UConn plus the 10.5. FAU versus Middle Tennessee State college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. FAU is 5-5 with their 52-7 road win at FIU. Alice posted 385 yards, 281 rushing on 60 carries. Defensively, they limited FIU passing game to 74 yards, allowed 203 rushing on 36 carries. N'Kosi Perry completed 63% of his passes for 4.7 yards per attempt. He threw for 104 yards and 2 touchdowns, plus rushed for 2 touchdowns. Perry on the season a 57% completion rate with 7.1 yards per attempt. Middle Tennessee State improved to 5-5 with that 24-14 home win to Charlotte. Blue Raiders gained 306 yards with 103 rushing on 34 carries. Defensively, MTSU held the 49ers to nearly 3.5 yards per rush with 277 passing on 49 attempts. Nicholas Vitatio completed 76% of his passes with 7 yards per attempt. He threw for 203 yards with an interception and fumble. On the season, Vitatio 65% completion rate, 6.4 yards per attempt. Starter Chase Cunningham has missed the last game and reason was undisclosed. Back-to-back road games for FAU. They have put together back-to-back wins as they defeated UAB at home 2 weeks ago. Last 3 games, FAU is allowing 6 yards per rush attempt. Would believe that the Blue Raiders may look to run more with their backup under center. Play here will be Middle Tennessee State here at plus the 6. FIU versus UTEP college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. FIU moved to 4-6 with their 52-7 home defeat to FAU. Golden Panthers gained 277 yards with 203 rushing on 38 carries. Defensively, they surrendered 4.5 yards per rush to the Owls with 104 passing on 34 attempts. Grayson James completed 34% of his passes, a season low 2.2 yards per attempt. On the year, James a 59% completion rate, 5.6 yards per attempt. UTEP fell to 4-6 after their 37-30 road defeat at Rice. Miners posted 313 yards in this one, 154 rushing on 36 carries. Gavin Hardison injured his leg and left the game. On the season, Hardison a 52% completion rate with 6.5 yards per attempt. Calvin Braunholtz completed 70% in relief, 5.6 yards per attempt. This season, Braunholtz a 67% completion rate with 6.3 yards per attempt. Now, the Golden Panthers defense, the past 3 games, allowing 483 yards, 4.7 yards per rush, 7.8 yards per pass attempt. Utah pass defense in this same period giving up 254 yards, 9.8 yards per attempt. The play here will be FIU and UTEP over 51. Fresno State versus Nevada college football pick Saturday. Fresno State improved to 6-4 with their 37-30 road win at UNLV. Bulldogs gained 381 yards, 68 of it rushing on 26 carries. Defensively, they allowed 5.5 yards per rush to the Rebels with 172 passing yards on 33 attempts. Jake Kaner completed 82% of his passes, 9.2 yards per attempt. He threw for 313 yards, 3 touchdowns. On the year, Haener, a 75% completion rate with 8.8 yards per attempt. Nevada fell to 2-8 with their 41-3 home defeat to Boise State. Wolfpack put up 250 yards, 127 rushing on 38 carries. On defense, they surrendered over 5.5 yards per run with 261 passing yards on 27 attempts. Oklahoma State transfer Shane Illingworth completed 43% of his passes with 4.1 yards per attempt. He had 123 yards passing. Now this season, Illingworth, a 58% completion rate, 5.2 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Wolfpack averaging 256 yards. On the road, the Bulldogs averaging only 346 yards. The play hero beat Fresno State and Nevada under 54. Georgia State versus James Madison, college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Georgia State moves to 4-6 with their 31-28 home defeat to UL Monroe. Panthers gained 535 yards with 186 rushing on 56 carries. Defensively, Georgia State allowed under 3 yards per carry with 225 passing yards on 29 attempts. Panthers surrendered a block punt interception return for a touchdown. Darren Granger completed 62% of his passes with 8.7 yards per attempt. He threw for 349 yards with a touchdown and interception. On the season, Granger a 57% completion rate with 7.7 yards per attempt. James Madison moves to 6-4 after their 37-3 road win at Old Dominion. Dukes gained 492 yards with 188 rushing on 51 carries. Defensively, they held the Monarchs to over 2 yards per rush with 149 passing yards on 26 attempts. Todd Centeio completed 85% of his passes, 14.5 yards per attempt. He threw for 304 yards and an interception. This season, Centeio a 63% completion rate, 9.5 yards per attempt. Centeio has 17 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. Panthers have covered 8 straight on the road against a team with a home winning record. On the road, the Panthers are averaging 278 rushing with 6 yards per attempt. And their defense allowed only 47% completion rate and 5 yards here per attempt. The player will be Georgia State at plus 9.5. Houston versus East Carolina, college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Houston improved to 6-4 with their 43-36 home win to Temple. Cougars posted 485 yards with 196 rushing on 26 carries. Defensively, they held the Owls under 2 yards a carry, but 486 passing on 59 attempts. Clayton Tune completed 72% of his passes with 7.2 yards per attempt. He's passed for 289 yards with 3 touchdowns and an interception. Season-wide, Tune a 68% completion rate with 8 yards per pass attempt. East Carolina 6-4 after their 27-25 road defeat at Cincinnati. Pirates put up 454 yards with 174 rushing on 33 carries. Defensively, ECU held the Bearcats to under 3 yards per carry with 244 passing yards on 31 attempts. Holton Ahlers completed 56% of his passes with 6.1 yards per attempt. He's passed for 280 yards and 2 touchdowns. On the year, Ahlers' career highs here. 68% completions, 8 yards per attempt. He has 20 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. Past 3 games, Cougars averaging 562 yards while allowing 535 yards. And getting torched through the air in this period for passing-wise, averaging 8.8 yards per pass attempt against them. And the play here will be Houston, East Carolina over 67. Louisiana versus Florida State, college football pick Saturday. Louisiana is 5-5 with their 36-17 home win to Georgia Southern. Raging Cajuns gained 435 yards with 242 rushing on 39 carries. Defensively, they held the Eagles to 3 yards per rush with 358 passing on 53 attempts. Ben Wooldridge completed 55% of his passes for 6.2 yards per attempt. He threw for 193 yards with 3 touchdowns and 1 interception. On the year, Wooldridge a 56% completion rate with 6.8 yards per attempt. Florida State improved to 7-3 with their 38-3 road win at Syracuse. Seminoles posted 420 yards with 230 rushing on 40 carries. Defensively, they limited the Orange to 3 yards per rush with 65 passing yards on 22 attempts. Jordan Travis completed 91% in the victory, 6.7 yards per attempt. He threw for 155 yards and 3 touchdowns. Travis this season, a 65% completion rate, 20 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 8.9 yards per attempt. Seminoles 3 straight wins, all by 25 or greater points. Past 3 games, Seminoles averaging 505 yards, allowing 204 Raging Cajuns in this period allowing 257 passing yards with 7.3 yards per attempt. The play here will be Florida State at minus the 23.5. Louisiana Tech versus Charlotte, college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Louisiana Tech fell to 3-7 with their 51-7 road defeat to UTSA. Bulldogs gained 259 yards with 112 rushing on 31 carries. Defensively, they surrendered nearly 6 yards per rush to the Roadrunners with 226 passing on 30 carries. Landry Liddy completed 54% with 5.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 138 yards and a touchdown with 2 interceptions. This season, Liddy a 64% completion rate, 6.1 yards per attempt. The freshman played for Parker McNeil, who has completed 57% of his passes with 8.9 yards per attempt. Now, Charlotte are 2-9 after their 24-14 road defeat at Middle Tennessee State. 49ers gained 383 yards with 106 rushing on 38 carries. Defensively, they held the Blue Raiders to 3 yards per rush with 203 passing on 29 attempts. Chris Reynolds, 57% completion in this one, 5.7 yards per attempt. He passed for 277 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. Now this year, Reynolds' 63% completion rate, 7.9 yards per attempt. Louisiana Tech defense is giving up 500 yards per game on the road. Charlotte, 529 at home. 49ers do a good job of moving that football through the air at home with their experienced quarterback. The play will be Louisiana Tech and Charlotte over 64.5. Marshall versus Georgia Southern, college football pick Saturday. Marshall moved to 6-4 with their 28-21 home win to Appalachian State. Thundering Herd gained 341 yards, 121 rushing on 37 carries. On defense, they limited the Mountaineers to 3 yards per rush with 177 passing on 34 attempts. Cam Fancher hit on 57% of his passes, 8 yards per attempt. He threw for 225 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. On the year, Fancher a 55% completion rate with 6.3 yards per attempt. Georgia Southern fell to 5-5 with their 36-17 road defeat at Louisiana. Eagles gained 430 yards with 72 rushing on 25 carries. Defensively, they did give up 6 yards per run to the Raging Cajuns with 193 passing on 32 attempts. Kyle Van Treese completed 57% of his passes, 6.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 325 yards and a touchdown. On the year, Van Treese a 61% completion rate with 7.1 yards per attempt. Thundering Herd defense in great form over the past 3 games are allowing 257 yards, 2.8 yards per rush, and 4.8 yards per pass attempt. Eagles defense in this span allowing 470 yards, 5.9 yards per rush, 7 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be Marshall minus 4.5. Massachusetts versus Texas A&M, college football pick Saturday. Massachusetts fell to 1-9 with their 35-33 road defeat at Arkansas State. Minutemen a season high 475 yards with 168 rushing on 51 carries. On defense, they surrendered over 5 yards per rush with 142 passing yards on 18 attempts. Brady Olson completed 50% of his passes with 6.4 yards per attempt. He threw for 178 yards and a touchdown with 2 picks. This season, Wilson a 51% completion rate with 5.5 yards per attempt. Texas A&M fell to 3-7 after their 13-10 road defeat at Auburn. Aggies gained a season low of 215 yards with 94 rushing on 24 carries. Defensively, Texas A&M limited the Tigers' passing game but allowed 270 rushing on 55 carries. Connor Wegman completed 39% of his passes with 3.4 yards per attempt. This season, Wegman a 52% completion rate with 5.8 yards per attempt. On the road, UMass gains only 301 yards and allows 5.2 rushing per game. This could be a spot where the Aggies just let all out their frustrations. Recent games, the Minutemen scored 10 at UConn, 13 at home to New Mexico State. The player will be Texas A&M at minus 32. New Mexico State and Missouri, college football pick. This one here goes off on Saturday. New Mexico State is 4-5 with their 51-14 home win to FCS Lamar. They posted 433 yards. They've won 4 of 5 with their other wins coming to UMass, New Mexico, and Hawaii. Diego Pavia is completing 48% of his passes for 6.1 yards per attempt. Missouri fell to 4-5 with their 66-24 road defeat at Tennessee. Tigers gained 389 yards with 172 rushing on 37 carries. On defense, they surrendered over 6 yards per run to the Volunteers with 460 passing on 38 attempts. Brady Cook completed 59% of his passes for 6.8 yards per attempt. He threw for 217 yards and 2 touchdowns. This season, Cook a 65% completion rate with 7.2 yards per attempt. Aggies defense on the road surrendering 411 yards, 5.2 yards per rush, 8 yards per pass attempt. New Mexico State struggled to score at Wisconsin and Minnesota. The play will be New Mexico State and Missouri under 46.5. Old Dominion versus Appalachian State. College football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Old Dominion fell to 3-7 with their 37-3 home defeat to James Madison. Monarchs offense produced 227 yards with 78 yards rushing on 29 carries. Defensively, ODU allowed 3.5 yards per rush to the Dukes with 304 passing yards on 22 attempts. Hayden Wolf completed 54% of his passes, 5.1 yards per attempt. He passed for 112 yards and 2 interceptions. This year, Wolf, a 56% completion rate with 6.8 yards per attempt. Appalachian State fell to 5-5 with their 28-21 road defeat to Marshall. Mountaineers gained a season-low 293 yards with 116 rushing on 40 carries. Defensively, they held the Thundering Herd to just over 3 yards per rush with 220 passing on 29 attempts. Chase Bryce completed 44% of his passes, 5.2 yards per attempt. He passed for 177 yards with a touchdown and interception. On the year, Bryce, 63% completion rate, 7.9 yards per attempt. At home, the Mountaineers averaging 438 yards with 4.9 yards per rush and 7.9 yards per attempt. ODU on the road giving up 442 yards with 245 passing with 8 yards per attempt. A win, and the Mountaineers are bowl eligible before they hit the road next week at Georgia Southern. The player will be Appalachian State here at minus 15.5. San Jose State versus Utah State. College football pick Saturday. San Jose State fell to 6-3 with their 43-27 road defeat at San Diego State. Spartans a season low 223 yards, 28 rushing on 21 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 3 yards per rush with 268 passing yards on 23 attempts. Chevin Cordero completed 57% of his passes with 5.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 195 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. This season, Cordero a 60% completion rate with 7.4 yards per attempt. Utah State improved to 5-5 with their 41-34 road win at Hawaii. Aggies posted 374 yards, 136 rushing on 44 carries. Defensively, they did allow 7 yards per run with 306 passing yards on 47 attempts. Cooper Legis has completed 67% of his passes, 9.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 238 yards and 3 touchdowns. On the air, Legis a 61% completion rate with 6.8 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, both offenses struggling. The Spartans rushing for 1.9 yards per rush, Aggies at 3. Utah State defense has been strong against the pass. Spartans in this period allowing 274 yards passing for 9.6 yards per attempt. The play here will be Utah State minus the 1. South Alabama versus Southern Miss. College football pick Saturday. South Alabama improved to 8-2 after a 38-21 home win to Texas State. Jaguars gained 380 yards, 106 rushing on 39 carries. On defense, South Alabama held the Bobcats to over 3 yards per rush with 143 passing on 42 attempts. Carter Bradley completed 59% of his passes for 8.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 274 yards and 4 touchdowns. This season, Bradley a 64% completion rate, 7.9 yards per attempt. Southern Miss is 5-5 after their 26-23 road defeat at Coastal Carolina. Golden Eagles posted 365 yards with 52 rushing on 28 carries. Defensively, Southern Miss allowed over 4 yards per carry with 191 passing on 15 attempts. Third string Trey Lowe completed 53% of his passes, 8.2 yards per attempt. He did pass for 295 yards and a touchdown on the season low, a 51% completion rate with 8.6 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Jaguars defense holding teams to 251 yards. Inaccurate quarterback play by the Golden Eagles is a concern. The play here will be South Alabama minus 7.5. Monroe and Troy college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Monroe 4-6 with their 31-28 road win at Georgia State. Warhawks put up 300 yards, 75 rushing on 28 carries. Defensively, Monroe allowed over 3.5 yards per rush with 349 passing on 41 attempts. Chandler Rogers completed a season low 52%. 7.8 yards per attempt. He passed for 225 yards and an interception. This season, Rogers a 69% completion rate with 8.1 yards per attempt. Troy 8-2 after their 10-9 home win to Army. Trojans gained here 264 yards, a season low, with 72 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, the Trojans limited the Black Knights passing game and allowed 275 rushing yards on 62 carries. Gunnar Watson completed a season low 48%. 6.2 yards here per attempt. On the air, Watson a 61% completion rate, 8.2 yards per attempt. He's thrown for 9 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. Monroe defense on the road has struggled, giving up 480 yards, 4.9 yards per attempt, and 9.7 yards per pass attempt. At home, Troy is passing for 302 yards, 9.9 yards per pass attempt. Warhawks putting up 22 points per game on the road. The play here will be UL Monroe and Troy over 48. UNLV versus Hawaii college football pick Saturday. UNLV fell to 4-6 with their 37-30 home defeat to Fresno State. Rebels gained 391 yards, 219 rushing on 39 carries. Defensively, they surrendered under 3 yards per rush with 313 passing yards on 34 attempts. Doug Brumfield completed 54% of his passes with 5.2 yards per attempt. He passed for 172 yards. Now this season, Brumfield a 65% completion rate, 7.5 yards per attempt. Hawaii sits at 2-9 after their 41-34 home defeat to Utah State. Warriors posted a season high in this one. It was a pretty good performance here. 514 yards, 235 rushing on 34 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 3 yards per run to the Aggies with 238 passing on 24 attempts. Braden Shager completed 50% of his passes, 6.7 yards per attempt. He passed for 306 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Now on the year, Shager is a 55% completion rate, 5.8 yards per attempt. Rebels have lost 5 straight on the road, UNLV averaging only 293 yards a game. Hawaii at home averaging 365 yards, 4.7 yards per rush. They are showing improvement as the season wore on. The play here will be Hawaii at plus the 11. UTSA versus Rice college football pick for Saturday. UTSA improved to 8-2 with their 51-7 home win to Louisiana Tech. Roadrunners gained 484 yards with 258 rushing on 41 carries. Defensively, they held the Bulldogs to nearly 4 yards per rush with 147 passing on 31 attempts. Frank Harris completed 69% of the passes in the win, 8.3 yards per attempt. This season, Harris a 69% completion rate with 8.5 yards per attempt. Rice fell to 5-5 after their 45-10 road defeat at Western Kentucky. Owls gained 326 yards with 165 rushing on 40 attempts. On defense, Rice surrendered over 5 yards per rush with 377 passing yards on 33 attempts. TJ McMahon completed 73% of his passes for 5.9 yards per attempt, but threw 2 interceptions. This season, McMahon a 60% completion rate with 7.9 yards per attempt. Shaquille Itras relieved and completed 61% of his passes for 5.3 yards per attempt, but had 2 interceptions. Rice defense passed 3 games, giving up 441 yards, 5.1 yards per rush, 10 yards per pass attempt. In this period, the Roadrunners averaging 5.2 yards per rush, 7.4 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be UTSA at minus the 12.5.